The death toll reaches at least 66 in Syria today, and the bombardment continues on the cities and towns. Syrians continue to demonstrate, demanding freedom and condemning the massacres committed against unarmed civilians. And UN accuses Al-Assad regime of violating human rights, and the White House says that the regime is losing control over the situation. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The Syrian Human Rights Network reported that the devastating murder of 40 victims today in Damascus and its outskirts following violent shelling and a fierce military campaign in the area. The regime's forces also bombed the area heavily and besieged it with large reinforcements, followed by a campaign raiding and randomly arresting dozens, all during deterioration of medical and humanitarian conditions due to the suffocating blockade and around the area. In Hamouria, the families were terrorized by massive explosions, which rocked the city, and a continuous storm of bullets fired from the barriers controlled by the regime's army. But despite the terror created by the regime's forces in the area, families persisted on filling the streets with their voices affirming they will continue in their struggle to obtain freedom. The regime forces bombarded the towns of Al-Hama and Qadsiya near the presidential palace. This comes amid predictions that the regime is being surrounded and suffocated and will fall soon. More we see in the following report.
Images broadcasted from Al-Hama and Qadsiya in Damascus suburbs revealed what Hafez al-Assad had planned decades ago, where he gave out orders and allowed families of lieutenants to build and live in compounds that were spread randomly on the outskirts of most Syrian cities, where the compounds nowadays have become centers for the regime's military personnel on army bases, where the regime launches its attack from, targeting the residential buildings in the center of the cities, neglecting the fact that these civilians are just as equal as them. Allah. Brutal massacres were committed by the regime's army, supported by the guerrilla forces, where activists said that many of the guerrilla forces were actually members of Hezbollah's party that is positioned near Hama. In another manner, more than 36 victims were recorded by video and name as killed, regardless of dozens who were killed and were not found yet due to the spreading of the regime's militia. Meanwhile, recent revelations have revealed predictions about the approaching battle from the presidential palace that is positioned on top of a mountain which is open to the entire capital of Damascus that is only 8 kilometers away, which means that, and according to politicians, that the regime is being surrounded and suffocated from all sides, leading to its soon-to-be downfall. Activists of the revolution in Qadsiya and Al-Hama reported big defections that occurred in the presidential guard that is positioned in the Adrej Mountains next to Al-Hama, which caused the regime to attack the citizens in the city and bombarding Qadsiya and many other areas that belong to the regime, in order to cover up the events going on inside the regime's closed doors. The revolution is close to victory. That is what the Syrian citizens say that already noticed that the government has become shaky and is on the edge of breaking apart, which explains the increasing massacres committed by the regime in the recent times.
The Syrian Human Rights Network has reported that 66 people were murdered in Syria today, mostly in Idlib, after the government forces renewed shelling of the city, where many of its villages and towns were shelled by artillery fire and rockets, and other towns were attacked by the regime's air missiles, while the Syrian Freedom Army was able to down one of the regime's helicopters that was flying at a low altitude. In Idlib suburbs, many people were killed and wounded due to the very fierce military campaign committed by the regime. The regime forces invaded the towns and villages of Ma'arat al-Nu'man, Khan Sheikhoun, Kafr Nabil and Saraqib, where the forces bombed the cities using military planes and mortar shells. The government troops also blocked all the exits and entrances leading to the town amid massive numbers of civilians who were trying to run away from the city, fearing that the regime will commit yet another massacre. Meanwhile, the citizens of Sarmada and many other towns in the province took to the streets in massive protests that condemned the regime's crimes and demanded its downfall. Meanwhile, the town of Khan al-Sibel in Idlib suburbs was heavily bombarded by tanks and military planes, where over 100 buildings were destroyed, which means that over 60% of the buildings are destroyed or partially destructed in Idlib. And many images broadcasted on the internet showed a mortar shell that fell on one of the buildings, which led to its burning amid the citizens' desperate calls for help. We stay in Idlib, where the residents marched in anti-government rallies in Kelli, Fraika and Ma'arat Hurma, denouncing the regime's crimes and chanting for freedom. Protests that came out in the neighborhood of Al-Mufti in Al-Hasaka were targeted by the security and guerrilla forces. This bombardment was followed by many protests that came out in many neighborhoods of Al-Hasaka, where, according to reports, 2 victims were killed by the regime forces. Moving to the south of Syria, where heavy shelling took place in the city of Kafr Shams in Daraa, which was also invaded by the government forces, sparking the residents' fears of a new massacre. Elsewhere, many anti-government demonstrations were carried out in several towns, demanding the downfall of the Assad regime and describing it as a tyrant and criminal regime. Coming up later in the bulletin, citizens in Sweden chant against the regime in the anniversary of Tadmor massacre. Welcome back. You are watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. Despite all the violations committed by Al-Assad regime and the increase of the military campaigns, the Syrian citizens are hopeful that their revolution will succeed in achieving freedom. More about the Syrian revolution we will see in the following report.
The military campaigns of the government increased, where the regime forces targeted every single corner in Syria that demanded its overthrow. From northern to western Syria, the regime's violations took the lives of many civilians, as well as destroying houses in Aleppo suburbs, Idlib, Daraa, Homs and Deir ez-Zor. But the regime's operations turned against it, where the Syrian Freedom Army retaliated strongly, which made it able to take over several military and security bases of the regime. The Syrian Freedom Army's operations that are being carried out with its basic weaponry is causing a moderate amount of damage in the government's army, whose weaponry is limitless. The Syrian Freedom Army's main purpose is to prevent the regime's army from committing more massacres in the Syrian cities. The losses of the regime's army included the loss of an aircraft in Idlib province, as well as reportedly a fall of another aircraft in Daraa, in addition to the artillery and tank losses.
تدمير دبابة بالكامل من قبل كتائب لواء صقور الشام. الله أكبر والعزة لله.
Many members of the Syrian Freedom Army were able to protect the civilians and defend them, especially after the amount of soldiers that joined it, as well as the defected military personnel ranking soldier up to lieutenant from the government's army. And according to the defected soldiers, the reason for splitting was realizing the regime's crimes against civilians. The constant defections in the regime's army, whose latest number reached 300 in Idlib alone, pushes the Syrian Freedom Army to find defensive ways in order to prevent themselves from being targeted by the military planes of the government, in addition to looting to the weapons of the regime after finishing every battle with the regime, who's fighting for its power and not its country's freedom.
23 ذخيرة من عصابات الأسد.
Staying with the revolution updates in various Syrian cities, where in Homs heavy shelling continued on the city of Tel Bisa. The regime also attacked the city of Al-Qusayr and Buwaida with bombs, and they carried out a fierce security campaign in several areas of Homs and shelled others with air missiles, killing at least 10 civilians so far. Heavy artillery fired from Al-Tala'a barracks terrorized the towns in Deir ez-Zor, just as the regime's forces brutally fired deadly bullets at the medics of the murdered victim Egjma al-Matar. This persistent shelling targeting the towns of Deir ez-Zor demolished the property of the innocent civilians, and following the attacks, several demonstrations crowded the streets, demanding the release of the unrightfully imprisoned civilians and the downfall of the current Syrian regime. Brutal shelling that saw no end murdered at least 9 victims in the area of Jabal Shahshibo in Hama. Fired from the surrounding barriers of the regime's forces, this massive bombing left behind huge losses of civilians and equipment, especially in the town of Al-Mistriha. The shelling also engulfed the city of Al-Latamina, during which civilians' houses were also raided by tanks and randomly bombed with missiles. The suburbs of Aleppo have witnessed severe shelling by tanks and helicopters, prompting activists to launch distress calls regarding poor humanitarian conditions. Furthermore, members of the Syrian Freedom Army successfully secured a helicopter airstrip in Jabal Sam'an, which contained radar equipment and missile launchers that they are now in full control of. However, in Aleppo, the regime's army executed an operation consisting of a campaign of raids and arrests targeting civilians' homes, particularly in the district of Salah ad-Din and As-Sukkari. According to activists from the Aleppo suburbs, extensive bombing by the regime forces was witnessed targeting Al-Ka'an mountain in the village of Kafr Karmin. Activists also broadcasted images showing the unfortunate displacement of terrorized families from the village of Babkbe out of their homes due to the dreadful shelling of the regime's forces. In the meantime, in the neighborhoods of Aleppo, massive student demonstrations went out chanting for freedom and the overthrow of the regime, but the regime forces persisted on the use of violence to disperse these relentless protests. The Syrian businessman Nasser al-Hajj Hussein was kidnapped by the guerrilla forces of the regime, where the kidnappers demanded the amount of 15 million Syrian liras as a ransom for his release, noting that the Nasser's family was harassed throughout the years by the regime. And the outskirts of Slayba and Ram al-Janubi witnessed arrest campaigns by the regime forces, where the artillery shelling continued on many rebellious villages in Latakia. And despite the besiegement and the heavy military deployment, protests came out in the town of Salma in Latakia suburbs, where the citizens supported and troubled cities and demanded al-Assad's downfall. UN investigators have confirmed that the Assad regime has committed many humanitarian and human rights violations that included executions across the country through military campaigns that they carried out in order to curb the revolution. The investigators' report also said that the situation on ground is deteriorating on an alarming scale.
The Human Rights Council, concerned with the gross human rights violation, has condemned the Syrian regime's crimes in the 47 members forum in Geneva today. The UN Investigating Commission has also reported an increase of violence in Syria on an alarming scale, saying that it had reasonable grounds to believe that government forces and militiamen have perpetrated unlawful killings, arbitrary arrests and detention, torture and sexual assaults on men, women and children, as well as other forms of ill treatment in the reporting period.
The Commission considers it has reasonable grounds to believe that government forces and Shabira have perpetrated unlawful killings, arbitrary arrests and detention, torture and other forms of ill treatment in the reporting period.
And regarding the Hawla massacre, the report has pointed out that armed groups loyal to the Syrian government may have been behind the killing of more than 100 innocent civilians, mostly women and children in Al-Hawla. The accusations were dismissed by the Syrian regime's representative, who, before announcing his withdrawal from the forum, warned that all forms of cooperation with the Human Rights Council would stop.
To find more about this situation, we speak to Donatella Riviera, Senior Advisor to the Crises in Amnesty International in London. Donatella, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, as we just saw that the Human Rights Council today blamed the Syrian regime mostly for the grave humanitarian situation in Syria, do you think this will change anything, or has it fallen on deaf ears?
Well, I mean, as we know, the Syrian regime has not even allowed the UN Commission of Inquiry to get access to the country. So I unfortunately don't think that the Syrian government will take much note of what this report as highlighted, as the Syrian government has been disregarding the reports by human rights organizations, including by Amnesty International. What is needed is much greater pressure from the international community on the Syrian regime to ensure that, just to begin with, that they give access to the Commission of Inquiry so that it can go to Syria and carry out its work.
Exactly, Donatella. Well, my second question was this. Why, under which pretext are they not allowing the humanitarian or the human rights investigators to go into these areas? What is the excuse they're giving?
Well, as you know, the Syrian regime is not giving any excuse at all. It is simply not granting access. I mean, the chief of the Commission of Inquiry was able to go to Damascus a few days ago for some meetings, but the Commission itself has not been able to carry out its investigation. We at Amnesty International, we have not been allowed into the country. I had to go in without government permission, and so our journalists are doing the same. On the Commission of Inquiry, I would point out that some of the countries that are talking tough, so to speak, like the United States and Great Britain and France and others, they have not pushed enough to request and to put pressure on the Syrian government to allow the UN Commission of Inquiry. So there has to be greater pressure from the international community because the Syrian government has quite clearly shown that it will not do it by itself. And I mean, the Syrian government is, after all, responsible for the vast majority of the violations that have been committed in Syria. So we can understand why it does not want independent investigations to find out about the crimes that it has committed.
Yes. Well, let's hope that the meeting next Saturday in Geneva will change that. Donatella Riviera, Senior Advisor to the Crises in Amnesty International in London. Many thanks for your valuable input. Coming up in the bulletin, citizens in Sweden chant against the regime in the anniversary of Tedmor massacre. The Turkish Prime Minister issued another warning to Damascus, saying that Turkey will not hesitate to do what is necessary and respond in the most firm way to any hostile attack or threat against it.
We will not refrain from teaching a lesson to the state of gangs that lost its legitimacy in the eye of its people, imposing state terror to its people, and trying to test Turkey's greatness.
Meanwhile, the Syrian opposition group is working to form a group at U.S. Congress to step up pressure on Obama's administration to increase action against the Syrian authorities.
Our aim and goal to establish a Syria working group or a Syrian caucus within the Congress. It's non-partisan. It has a Democrats and it has Republicans. Both can work together to help the Syrian people and to put some pressure on the administration to make a shift in its policy. Our mission, it's clear that the U.S. have to do some actions. Everyone is looking for the U.S. leadership. Everyone is expecting for the United States to do more actions to protect the civilians in Syria.
In an important development, demonstrations took place in the province of El Suwaida, near the military foundation located in the heart of the province. In this rare occurrence, the protests filled the streets, chanting in support of the afflicted cities in Syria, as well as demanding the downfall of Bashar al-Assad's regime. According to activists in the area, security forces deployed by the regime launched a campaign of raids and arrests to disperse the demonstrations, and soon after, detaining several other activists. The deputy of the UN and Arab envoy to Syria, Kofi Annan, said that an international meeting regarding Syria will take place this Saturday in Geneva. He added that they are working with a number of member states that have a major influence on Syria to reach a political solution to the conflict.
Since March 2011, unrest in Syria shows no signs of receding. Internationally, tension was jacked up after Syria shot down a Turkish jet last week, an act deplored by NATO and other Western nations. And despite the confirmation of Hervé Latsous, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, that the international observers' mission in Syria will remain on hold due to the escalating violence, Kofi Annan invited the top diplomats of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to a Saturday meeting of the Action Group for Syria, which will work on steps to implement the 6-point peace initiative. Annan asserted that the Action Group for Syria should agree on guidelines and principles for a Syrian-led political transition that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people and agree on actions that will make these objectives a reality on the ground. Meanwhile, the White House spokesman said that the regime lost the control over the situation on the ground, noting that the transition process should not include the staying of al-Assad in power. From her side, the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, speaking in Finland, said if participants can meet on the basis of a roadmap to a political transition in Syria, then a meeting makes a lot of sense and could be a turning point. Syria is high on Clinton's agenda, but U.S. officials have not yet confirmed whether she will attend the meeting on the escalating conflict in Syria that the international mediator Kofi Annan is attempting to organize in Geneva this weekend.
Mr. Kidwan and Mr. Lansous on the situation in Syria.
And from his side, Russia's United Nations ambassador, Vitaly Churkin, said that Iran has to participate in this week's international meeting on Syria and confirmed that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will attend the Action Group for Syria meeting.
The Russian Research Center declared that Syria will be getting Russian air defense systems, refurbished helicopters and fighter jets that cost up to $500 million this year. Russia assures this despite the international pressure to halt arms sales to Damascus. It is expected, according to the report that Reuters obtained a copy of, that a dozen repaired MiG-29 modern fighter aircraft will be delivered in addition. This report expected that the first group will be delivered by the end of this year, indicating that these planes may provide air missiles and air-surface missiles capable of penetrating any of the no-fly zones over Syrian territories. And before we wrap up, here's a look at the main stories once again. The death toll reaches at least 83 in Syria today, and the bombardment continues on the cities and towns. Syrians continue to demonstrate, demanding freedom and condemning the massacres committed against unarmed civilians. And UN accuses al-Assad regime of violating human rights, and the White House says that the regime is losing control over the situation. Thank you for watching. This is it for us tonight. Join us again tomorrow for a summary of the latest updates.